Nosai Kumlana Black Gemara. We are up to Daf Kuf Ches Amid Aleph, and the last thing we learned, I think you learned also, was that story with Rabba Baba Huna. That he was so insulted that he cursed out Rabba Baba Nachman. So we're up to right after that story, which is Amar Rav Yehuda. It's about 8-9 lines from the top of the page. Yeah, that's where you're up to. Is that right? Okay, I'm assuming that's right.
Correct. Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Okay. Amar Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda said, this is what you learn right now. We're actually going to learn in a couple of weeks in Bava Basra, so we'll talk more about it when we get there. That ches. But hakoil liigle gapa. When it comes to, I guess, needs of the community, let's say we have to build an enclosure, a wall for protection, everyone has to contribute for that wall. I feel it may ask me, even orphans, generally we don't take money from orphans, but since they directly benefit from it, we will take their money as well. Our Rabbanon loy, but the Rabbanon do not have to contribute for any of these defenses or anything for safety. And my timer, why not? Rabbanon don't need any protection. We can learn in Bava Basra and Yichayma, Zu Torah, that Torah is their protection. So they don't have to contribute at all for defenses and all that. But what about Lekaria, because they don't need it. Lekaria de Pasya, what about if they want to dig wells and sources of water supply? Then I feel Rabbanon. Even the Rabbanon have to contribute because they also need it. They directly benefit from it. But when
these are not reasons for not contributing. There's got to be a more.
It's exactly that. If they have no benefit, why should they contribute?
Well, it's the same in any situation when you're part of a chevra, you need to do your part.
We are going to learn in Bava Basra, the Zion Rebbeis in the bottom, that a couple of things. That when the community has to pay for things. For example, you have to pay. The Gemara is going to talk about, do you pay according to how your economic status or how many members there are to your family? Because you can argue that you should pay according to the members of the family because that's how many people benefit. Or maybe the richer should pay more and the poor should pay less. We're going to have a whole discussion about paying for a chazan in a shul. The Gemara doesn't really talk to it. How do you divide the paying the chazan in a shul?
Yeah.
Do you pay according to larger families pay more and smaller families pay less? Or you pay according to your economic status, or do we do half and half?
Oh, I don't want to. I don't like chazan, so I don't want to be part of it at all.
You're stuck. Once you're in shul, you're in shul.
It's an argument.
Then we have a situation where you pay for defense. You're traveling a caravan. You're traveling, and you have to pay for guards or security, to help you guys out. Do you pay that according to the nefashos, according to the members of your family, or according to mammon, according to your wealth, your economic status? And then we may say half and half. Because the rich benefit more. It all has to do with benefit. Everybody, so the Gemara says you only pay because you benefit from it. And since the Rabbanon have absolutely no need for security, because their Torah protects them, they don't have to contribute.
But
and we'll talk more about it in Bava Basra.
If I was taking Paul's argument, I'd bring a raya from Kibush Eretz Israel when they came in and Gad Menashe had to go and fight before they got their land on the other side of the Yarden.
So one thing is totally unrelated to the next. That is over there is that there's a big argument if Eber Yarden is even considered part of Israel or not. Big machlekes in the poskim, and they were forfeiting their land in Eretz Yisrael. That's what they were doing. They were forfeiting their land in Eretz Yisrael, and in replace they wanted much bigger tracts of land on the other side. And Moshe Rabbeinu said that these are the conditions I'm going to give that to you. So I'm not sure what one thing has to do with another. That you cannot desert your brethren in their time of need.
I was just saying that that's not of their benefit.
So what? So what? You want me to give you for keeps? You want me to give you a piece of land that you are going to be the owner, the rightful owner, and possibly, according to many Rishonim, it should have the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. Well, these are the conditions that it has to happen. I think it through. Totally unrelated. But let's continue. We'll talk more about this when we get to Bava Basra. Then the Gemara continues. Ba'afilu Rabbanim goes a step further now. Even the Rabbanim, when we say that they have to contribute to, let's say, irrigation and all that, or wells, the creation of wells, they don't have to personally go out there and dig those wells. They don't have to do that. But they personally have to go out there and roll up their sleeves. And hear this: the rabbis don't roll up their sleeves, so you can't ask them to go there and to put their work. In fact, we learned in Psachim Daf Kufya Gimel that a rabbi shouldn't go out and work in public because it's not covered for the Torah. But we're talking about rabbis who Tarasun Nasun, who this is what their occupation is. They sit and learn all the time. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, and we'll talk more about this in Babasa, so let's leave it till there. It's only 2 weeks away. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, Likaya denara. So these are different dinim that Rabbi Yehuda said. Likaya denara. Let's say you have this irrigation there, that this river that sort of supplies all these different fields, and the river we had in the Durham, if you remember, about water supply, all these halachas of the rights of water supply, and that the people on the top of the river actually have the right to block up the river and so on. So what happens? You have a river that's providing water for many fields, down the track. But what happens? Rocks and other things get stuck into the water, and as a result, the water doesn't flow downwards. Who has to pay to remove all these rocks and these impediments? So the Gemara says here, Lekarya denora, for the river that has to be cleaned from time to time, has to be dredged or cleaned from time to time. Tatoi misayayila, the people on the bottom of the river definitely have to contribute their fair share because they are beneficiaries of this water. But Eloi misayay tatoi. But if the rocks and all of that forms on the bottom of the river, where only the last few fields are affected by it, and the ones before are not, they don't have to contribute al pi halacha. I mean, it'd be nice if they did, but they don't have to contribute al pi halacha. Bichilufa, and the converse is b'maya demitim, when you have rainwater. If you have rainwater where there's so much water, stormwater, and they have to get rid of it. So what they do is then, and the stormwater brings with it all kinds of mud and everything else. So they build some kind of channels that they take the water away from the city and go off to the ocean or wherever it goes. If that thing, let's say, got stuck on the bottom, so what happens is the water builds up and the mud builds up and it comes up all the way in the top and ruins all the fields. So in this case, if you want to clean it out on the bottom, all the fields on the top have to contribute because they are beneficiaries. But if it happens on the top, that something gets stuck and the water does not flow any further, the stormwater doesn't drain. So then the people on the bottom don't have to help out. They're happy. They have no stormwater with mud coming down to them. They don't have to contribute. In fact, Tanya Namehach, we learned very similar in a brisa, similar idea, principle. Chomesh ganis, hamestapkes mayim. You have 5 gardens. They're all getting water from the same source. V'niskalkel hamayin, and and something happened to the spring with the source of their water. Then kulon misaknes imalyenis. You have a river flowing. You have the first property, the second, the third, fourth, fifth. So if whatever, let's say the rupture, whatever happened, that's blocking the water from flowing, happened in the first field, then kulon misaknes, all the other fields have to participate. Nimtzas hatachtoina, but if it's only the last field that is affected by it, then the field in the bottom has to contribute to any of the other fields that have issues because he's the beneficiary. But if he's the only one that is affected, he only pays for himself and nobody's going to contribute. Likewise, if you have, let's say, 5 courtyards, and that you have again, they have all the rainwater, stormwater, that all goes to one place. Then it's kalkul habib, and something happened and the water doesn't flow, and therefore it's piling up and it's depositing dirt and mud in everybody's fields. If it happened on the bottom, everyone has to help out because they're all going to be adversely affected by it because it builds up the water and it builds back up and it deposits mud in everybody's fields. The first field has to help, regardless of which other field got affected by it. They have to support it. If they're the only ones affected, they're the only ones who are going to pay for it. Nobody else will contribute. Omar Shmuel. Shmuel said, Hai man the Arzik Beraksa Denora. Shmuel said that this is interesting. There was land that was like federal land, but federal land in those days, the government didn't claim ownership. It was just sort of belonged to no one. And they made a call that if anybody wants to take ownership and pleasure, but you have to pay taxes to the government, and then you will become the owner, the rightful owner. So now, what happens? Shmuel says, if somebody decides to take a property right next to the river and right next to the port. Now, when you're near the port, they need not only the water so the barges can go up and down in the port and so on, the jetty, but they also need space on the land itself so that they can, take things off the ships and put them somewhere. Where are they going to put them? They need dry land to be able to put them. And this guy over here decided to build himself a house right there because it's Hefker land. The government said anybody wants to take it. So this guy decided to purchase this land or pay the tax on this land. And he built himself a house right there where the port is, where the docks are. And now they have nowhere to place their barrels or all of their merchandise. So what happens? So if somebody decides to make a chazaka and right next to the docks, in the water, chatzife. He is a chutzpah. Why? Because he took away the land for the public usage. We do not, however, send him away. But today, it was a chutzpah what he did, but we don't have a legal right to evict him from his property. But today, the kakosri parsoy, that the parsoyim, the Persians, they write, knilach, they say, if you want to buy the property, you can buy the property ad malay tavari susya maya. They say that the property goes right into the water, and you own not only the land next to the sea, the river or the sea, but you also own a certain amount of the land in the sea itself until the depths that a horse's neck can't go any further. So this person's all his land, and he decides to use it for himself. And sluki nami masalkin lay. We are now going to remove him completely. Because so this is how Rashi learns. Rashi learns pshat. Somebody bought land, and they bought land, but there was still enough of a gap between the end of their land and the fence or the end of the land until the water. This guy came in, and all he bought was that parcel of land from the narrow part of the dry land. He bought that going into the river. That we decided that you're affecting, basically all you're doing is affecting others. Previously, we were talking about you bought a big tract of land, you built up a big house, and it happens to be that it encroaches on this public land that was being used by the public. Okay, so we don't have a right to expel you. But here, the guy, all he had was a little partition of land, a sliver of land, and that land is really necessary for public usage, for public benefit. And he decides to use it for his own personal benefit, we will evict him. That is how Rashi learns Pshat Nemara. Taisus learn differently. Taisus learns, interesting. Taisus says the Pshat here is no. The Pshat is, we're not talking about a second person came in. Taisus is not practical. What? There's a little sliver of land and this guy came in and decided to build himself. Taisus says, we're talking about the same person. But previously, the government only sold you the land up to the water. And this guy had a right to build a house, and we don't even want to evict it because he has a big property. But now that you have the rights all the way into the water, going to the to the depths of a horse's neck, then we can stop you from building there completely, and we can evict you from the land. Then the Gemara continues. We're going to introduce a principle called Bar Metzia. Bar Metzia means that if somebody wants to sell a property, a field, and this person has neighbors, the neighbors have first right of refusal. Now, as Taisus and others point out, we're not talking about the neighbor is going to pay less than anybody else. Market value. But if there's market value, the neighbors have first right of refusal. That's called Bar Metzia. And we all heard of that Bar Metzia. And the law is, the onus is not on the vendor, the onus is on the borrower. The vendor can say, I don't have to sell it all. If I didn't sell it, you would never have it. So what are you coming to me with tinus? But the borrower, the logic behind Bava Metzia, we say to the borrower, why do you have to buy this particular property? Buy somewhere else. Let the neighbor who has better use, can use the field. It's a lot cheaper to have two fields contiguous to each other. He can hire, the help and the one day's work. Otherwise, he'll have to hire two different workers. And so there's a benefit. And it's all predicated on a pasuk, v'asisa hayoshav hatoyv. It's predicated on a pasuk that you have to do the right thing. You have to be a mensch. And we're going to use that pasuk to the extent that if somebody goes ahead and buys it, and he and he prevents the neighbors from buying it, we will evict that person, and we will say to that person, your sale is not a sale, and whatever you paid for it, the vendor has to pay you, as we will discuss. That's the concept of Bava Metzia.
It's the same as the main shul seats in Mizrahi.
And we'll talk about shul seats in a minute, because actually it's in Shulchan Aruch. In Shulchan Aruch, it talks about shul seats, if there's Bava Metzia there or not. We'll come back to it in a minute. Let's go a little bit further. Says the Gemara. Let's say you have two brothers that have two properties near each other, but there's a little sliver of property in between. So a guy comes and he buys it right under the nose. There were two partners not far from each other, and there's a little property in between, and the guy came and bought it. It's a chutzpah, but it's a chutzpah behavior, but we're not going to evict you. We're not going to evict you. And Rashi explains that these Amoraim do not believe at all in the concept of Bava Metzia. We'll come back to that in a minute. Rab Nachman says, Nami misalkina. No, in this case, two brothers, two partners, they're really vasisa yoshev atayv. It's so wrong that two brothers should be near each other, so we're going to evict you. But if it's a stranger, not two brothers, but a neighbor, the neighbor says, I want to have first right. And somebody else bought it, we are not going to evict him because we don't believe in the concept of din Bava Metzia. Rashi learns. And the Herdoy Amar, even if it's a total stranger, in other words, not two brothers or anything else, but there's a neighbor, the neighbor wants to have the first right of refusal, and you come in and you buy right under his nose, we will evict you. But you will get your money back. It says, now, Taisus and the other Shem have a big problem with Rashi's shot, because they say everyone agrees with Bava Metzia. Everyone agrees with it. They bring different proofs. So Taisus limp shot, we'll just talk about Taisus. Taisus limp shot that is talking about a land that is hefker. It belongs to no one. And because it belongs to no one, these people could have bought it. The brothers could have bought it till now. They just did nothing. So therefore, technically, if that other person bought it, even though it's still he shouldn't have, or at least he should have warned the brothers, guys, if you don't buy it, I'm going to buy it. But so maybe he did the wrong thing, ethically. However, we're not going to evict him, because it's as if it's tantamount to these guys being moichel that we're not really interested in this land. Because otherwise, you could have bought it before. It was hefker. All the government said is whoever wants can have it, just pay us the taxes. So you should have done it. That's the case. But in principle, everyone agrees to Bava Metzia. That's how Taisus learns. Okay. The Rabbi Haigoin and the other Rishonim have a whole different shot here about Shutim. They want to say, interesting, that, no, we'll talk about it soon. And think about it further. Also, what happens, the buyer went, and he consulted the neighbor. And he said, look, I plan to buy this property. And I'm going to go buy it. And all the neighbors said, go buy it. Can the neighbor then change his mind or not? Once the neighbor says, go ahead and buy it, as if the neighbor is saying, I'm not interested, go. So it's yours. And you don't have to make a kinyan, it's over. The guy was moichel. But Medoy says, no. The neighbor, the neighbor said, you go buy it, doesn't mean that he's foregoing his rights. You know why the neighbor said go buy it? Because the neighbor knew that the owner of the property, if he would turn around and sell to the neighbor, he knew that it's worth more to the neighbor than to anybody else. And because it's worth more to the neighbor than anybody else, he'll probably charge him a premium. So he said to the guy, you go buy it, you negotiate, so you'll get a better price than me. He didn't say that. That's what his reasoning was. You'll get a much better price than me. And then I'm going to force you to sell to me at that same price. So therefore, I was never foregoing my rights. I was just being clever. And the din is yes, unless they made a kinyan. The hilchas atzalach mikvnei. And the law is you have to make a kinyan. But now we go a step further. Now that we know that it's a possibility that even if he made a kinyan, he didn't really mean to give it over to you. He just meant because he wanted to protect himself. So then if he wants to protect himself, when he said, you go in my place, what he was really doing is making you a shliach. You're like a shliach agent acting on his behalf because he'll then take it from you. Therefore, we have the following results. But if, by the way, if he said, I am not interested, if he said, I'm not interested, then he forfeits his rights to the property. Anyway, so he said, now that you say that he has to make a kinyan, what happens? He like kondomin. Let's say he didn't make a kinyan. He just said, go for it without making a kinyan. So as Rishonim learn in Mukiyas and others, it's tantamount, and that is like a shliach. In fact, Rashi in the bottom of the page just a little bit. He's like a shliach. Now, so if we didn't make a kinyan, if I told you go for it, and my plan is eventually to take it back for you, then you're acting as my agent. So ayakir v'zoil b'shusei zavin. If at all it goes up or it goes down in price, since you're my shliach, it all happens in the domain, in the possession of the neighbor. Meaning, but if it goes up in price, he still let's say the guy paid $100 for it, and the price went up to $200. He just has to give $100 to the lekeach, to the buyer, because any benefits is mine because you were acting on my behalf. You're my agent. But if it goes down in price, I still have to give you the $100 what you paid, because any loss is in the loss of the neighbor. Then we continue. Because what he does is he gives the money to the buyer. He says, you have no right to buy the field, and here I'm taking the field away from you. Remember, it's the buyer who did the wrong thing here by Bava Metzia. Now, what happens? What happens? Let's say the buyer, the lekeach, bought it for $100, but really the field is worth $200. When he goes to the buyer, he says, okay, I'm taking the field away from you. The question is, why did the buyer only pay you $100 if the field's actually worth $200? Is it because there's a certain rapport between this buyer and the vendor? It's a special discount he gave him. So the neighbor has no right to cash in on that, because to the neighbor, he would have charged the regular price, which is $200. Therefore, the neighbor has to pay to the buyer $200, not $100. Just because the buyer paid $100, that's the value of the field. The value of the field was $200. So the Gemara says it. Chazina, we see. If to everybody, the guy was desperate. The field was 200, but anybody would have come in and offered cash, he would have given it for 100 because he needed the cash straight away. You have the mayor, so he gives, there's no benefit to the buyer. He gives him the 100 and he takes the field from it. But if, let's say, it's not what happened, anybody else, he would have charged 200 to the buyer, to the actual lekeach, the vendor sold to him because he likes him or whatever the reason was. So then, then the neighbor has to pay $200 if he wants to take the field. What about Zavin bin Masan? What about if, let's say, he bought it for 200, but Shavi Meir is really worth 100. He bought it for 200, it worth 100. Sovereign Minay. So what happens now? Can he say, can he say, look, I wanted that you should benefit me and not that you should hurt me? And therefore, I can say that the whole deal, since you're my agent, and you did a bad deal here, that's only worth 100, you pay 200. So the whole kinyan should be dissolved. The whole, like nothing ever happened. Or I'm going to give you only 100 because anything more than that is your fault. You shouldn't have done it. I'm taking the property away. Says the Gemara. We had this on a number of occasions. When it comes to property, there's no deception. We had this in Hazov, because property eventually will reach that price. Or property to you is worth more money than the market, because you don't really care what the market value is so much. You need a house to live in, or you need a field to plant and to whatever you want to do there. And so therefore, you cannot say that it was done. So now the neighbor, if he wants the property, he has to pay $200 to the buyer, and otherwise the buyer keeps the property. What about Zovin Le Griva? The Ara, the Mitzah Nechase. This person wants to buy the field very much, and but a bunch of neighbors there, and they also want to buy the field. So this person is very clever. He went to the vendor. He said to the vendor, "You know what? I'm going to buy a little tract of land right in the center of your large field. I'll buy it, and now I'm a neighbor, like everybody else. In fact, I'm a neighbor on all four sides. So now, when you're ready to sell the field, I have priority." or at least I'm equal to everybody, and one neighbor cannot push away the other neighbor. So therefore, I want to buy the property. So Zavile Griba de Ara, he bought a small piece of land. The mitzvah nechas, some say Griba is the size of a saw, 50 by 50 yards. The mitzvah nechas, right in the center of the property. And now the question is this a trick? If it's a trick, it's useless, or it's genuine. So we see again, Chazina we see. If it's different than the rest of the field, no, the rest of the fields are average, a bonus, and the middle piece is a really premium quality land. So it makes sense that he sold you only that piece because you wanted premium quality land to plant saffron or whatever it is. Or if it's really inferior land, so the owner didn't really want it, and the rest of the field is good land, so then we can say, okay, it's a valid sale. It's not a trick because it's taka separate from the rest. Because it's a valid sale, and now he can turn around and claim I'm a Bava Metzia. And if there are a number of Bava Metzia, we'll see more later how it works. But if not, otherwise it's just a trick. And he wanted to be able to buy the rest of the property. So therefore, we will evict him. The Rashi goes, we're going to stop him even for buying a little piece of land. We're going to stop him completely. We don't want people in the future to forget this whole story and think that he's a neighbor. Matana, if I give someone a matana, the neighbor can't claim, oh, I have first right. I'm not interested to give you a matana. I want to give that to my friend, whatever. I want to give this person a gift, not to you. So there's no claim of Bava Metzia in the case of matana. However, the Rishonim say, what happens if I give the person a little piece of my land as a matana? And now he can claim he's a neighbor. And when I'm ready to sell my property, he can claim I'm a neighbor and I want to get it first. So we say as follows: the test is when you sell him the land, do you include in the land also that piece that you gave this person as a matana? Then obviously it was only a ruse. If you don't, it remains a gift. Then it's not a ruse at all. That was a gift, and now he turns around. He wants to be Bava Metzia. But Amema says, if you wrote on the star matana that you gave to this person, that I will guarantee you that if you ever lose this field, one of my lenders will come and extract it from you. I will give you another field in lieu. Then if you give achrayis, then then it's clear it's just a scheme because nobody guarantees a gift. You give somebody a gift, it's too bad if you lose it. The fact that he guaranteed it's clear that it was really a sale. And he just wanted to help the guy get in so that he can later claim to be a Bava Metzia. Other exceptions. If he sold all of his properties to one person, if he sold all of his properties to one person, lesbom, in other words, besides this property, this field that I want to sell, I have a few other fields all over the place. And there's one person that came and said, I'm buying all of your assets, all of them. Then there's no din of Bava Metzia. But there's no din of Bava Metzia because if I don't sell him this field, he won't buy my other ones. There's one thing is for sure. There's no din of Bava Metzia if it costs the vendor. The vendor is going to lose on the deal. Then he's not mukhli. For example, just like we said, that if the neighbor is going to pay less than the going rate, there's no din of Bava Metzia. Because why should the vendor lose out? There is a machlekes in the poskim. What happens if the neighbor is prepared to buy all the fields, all the assets? Then can he have a claim Bava Metzia or not? Because he's only a Bava Metzia on one of the fields, but there are numerous other fields. Do we say because he's a Bava Metzia on this field, he has first right? Or we say no, since the majority of the fields he's not a Bava Metzia, then he has no rights over anybody else. Another interesting exception. Somebody sold this house, this field to this person, and the guy moved away somewhere, and now the person wants to buy it back. Does the neighbor have a right to say, look, I'm the neighbor, you're not a neighbor, you left already? Or no? And we say, no, there's a certain attachment that a person has to the land. And therefore, there's nothing wrong with giving it back to the original owner. Usually we say when somebody sells a field, they were desperate for money. So now that this person is able to afford to buy it back, it's the right thing to do is let him buy it back. There's no Bava Metzia. Zovan me'akum, if you bought it from a goy, and the neighbor says, hey, I want to have first rights, or Zovin le'akum, or you sold it to a goy, and the neighbor says, oh, you should sold it to me. Let's explain. Zovan me'akum, if you bought it from a goy, the amalei, and what the neighbor said, hey, why did you, I should have first rights. So the buyer can say, "What are you talking about? You know how much I helped you? I got rid of the guy who was a threat to you personally, and now I got rid of this lion from your boundary. That's how you thank me. Be happy that I bought it." Zavin le'akum. So there's no bametzah selling it to a guy. Remember, we mentioned before that the entire din of bametzah revolves around the buyer, not around the seller. It's the buyer. The buyer should not have bought the property knowing that there are neighbors there. But if the buyer is a guy, he has no mitzvah. But shamute vade mishamtinle. One thing we do is we put the person, the vendor, in chedim for inviting the guy in. Unless he accepts any damage that happens from this. That in New York, there was this sickness in the 60s that if a colored person moved into the neighborhood, everybody ran away. It doesn't matter who the colored person was; everybody was scared and they ran away. So Jewish neighborhoods were falling like dominoes. And in Crown Heights, the same thing was happening like everywhere else. Brownsville is all gone. You drive through Brownsville today, you'll see all these churches with Magen Davids. As soon as a colored person walked in, everybody ran away. So the Lubavitcher in 1967 put out 2 letters. And in the letters, he talks about the halachas of doing that. These people rather sell to a colored person than to eat for whatever reason, I don't know. And as a result of that, the real estate prices came right down. And eventually people couldn't even sell the houses because nobody wanted to move in. And the prices were cut drastically. So the Rebbe quoted this Gemara as well as a few other Gemaras that you are not allowed to do that. And it says, Shamute, that any damage, this is like Zayl and anything else because it caused a deterioration, the loss of the value of the properties. And it took a few years till finally it sort of stopped. But that was the psyche back then. That's when everybody ran to Long Island and away from Brooklyn. Then the Gemara continues. Mashkanta. If a lender seized land as a mashkin, lesba mishum din of Bava Metzia. There's no din of Bava Metzia. Why is there no din of Bava Metzia? And the Amar Rav Ashi, remember we learned before. Rav Ashi said that the people of Machasi told me, my mashkanta. What's the origin of the word mashkin? Mashkin is security. And they said the word mashkanta, the word shochet. The shchuna gabei. He is the closest neighbor, and therefore the mashkin, the owner, the lender, not only is he holding on the mashkin, but we learned before he has certain rights in the mashkin. So he's closer than a neighbor because he's in the mashkin itself. He has rights in the mashkin itself. Then what is it? Ma'inav kimino the din of the Bava Metzia. This is regarding the law of Bava Metzia. Then where it continues, limkar berachik v'limkar v'liga b'karv. Let's say you have Reuben has a property far away. And a field far away. He can't really oversee it, it's too far. He wants to sell it. And an opportunity came up. There's a field close by. So he wants to sell that property. And the neighbor, and he found a buyer for it. And the neighbor says, hey, I want to buy that property. Afterwards, he comes afterwards, I should have bought that. I'm the neighbor. Or he has a property with poor quality soil, and an opportunity came up where you can buy a property which is much better soil. The din is lesba mishud din Bava Metzia, and why not? Because remember, the whole reason is to be a mensch. Asisa yoshev atay. But if an opportunity comes up for this vendor and he needs the money straight away, because if he delays, somebody else might buy that other property that he really wants to. It's closer to him or premium land. Therefore, he has no time to dilly-dally. Then, if he has a buyer, he can sell to the buyer, and there's no time to Bava Metzia. Because we don't want to hurt the vendor either. You don't want to hurt the vendor. Lekarga, and the same thing is lekarga or lemezayna or lekavura. If let's say he has to sell the property because he has to pay the taxes and he can't play around, he has to pay the taxes straight away. Or mezayna, he has to feed a widow or the daughters, and the dinner that Bezdin goes in and sells the property of the orphans in order to feed their mother or their sisters, or lekavura, to bury someone. Lesba mishum din Bava Metzia. There's no law of the law of Bava Metzia. Why? Again, anytime you're pressed, there's a situation that arises that is pressing for time. Well, if it's pressing for time, there's no law of Bava Metzia. He says the normally you have to, if Bezdin comes in and takes property, they have to make an auction and announce it for 30 days. And we had all the procedures we learned before, the protocols. But here you don't have to. You don't have to make any announcements at all because we don't have the 30 days that we need to make these announcements. There is an interesting machlekes Rishonim. How much time do we have for a bar mitzvah? What happens? Because the Rambam says that if somebody was overseas and somebody was sick, and they come back later, a few years later, and they find out that the neighbors sold the field, and they want to claim bar mitzvah, they cannot claim bar mitzvah. There's a whole question arises: what about if the person was here? So when does the neighbor have a right to say, "Well, you shouldn't"? Somebody bought the field, and the neighbor said, "Hey, you shouldn't have bought the field. Take the Torah and takes the field back." How long? How much time do we give? Is it a day, a year, 5 years, 10 years? And some Rishonim understand from the Rambam, the Rosh included, understands from the Rambam that there's no time limit. There's no statute of limitations. The guy, and they say it's so not fair. Why would anybody ever buy a field if there are neighbors and the neighbor doesn't buy the field either? Who's going to sell? How can you ever sell a field? People will be stuck. They can destroy the whole commercial market or the agriculture market. So therefore they say, the limit is a very short time limit, and they base it on the Gemara. We'll see in a minute how long the time limit is. Liisha uliyasma l'shutra. If let's say a woman, the whole logic of bar mitzvah is, why do you have to buy this field? Go buy somewhere else. But since women didn't really do business in those days, you're not going to tell if a woman wants to buy this field, and she's a farmer, you're not going to tell her, oh, go find yourself some other fields, because they weren't in the market for that way. So there's no bar mitzvah if a woman who's not a neighbor wants to buy the field, we'll allow her to buy the field. And the same thing, orphans, they don't go around door knocking. So if they want to buy this field, we'll allow them. And the neighbor has no rights over them. All the shutfi. And the same thing applies to partners. That if one partner sold the field to another partner, you cannot come along and say, oh, I'm a bar mitzvah, I'm the neighbor, I should get it ahead of the partner. You cannot say that. What exactly, because by partners, it's not so simple. There's we can think or we can argue. There's two ways of looking at partners. How do we understand, as the Tzeitzach Choshen explains in other places? Does partner mean that you own 50% of 100%, or do you own 100% of 50%? How do we understand partners? One way of learning is that you have 100% of 50%, but we don't know where it is. Which half is yours? We just don't know which half is yours. That's one way of looking at it. And therefore, if a neighbor comes over and says, that you want to sell a property to one of the partners, how do you know? And the partner says, let's say, we're not talking about, let's say, another case. Two partners have a big property, and part of that field is neighboring another field, and a stranger wants to buy. So the stranger, and this is actually what we had before in Amud Aleph, and the stranger says to the partners, how do you know that it's your half? That's if one of the partners wants to say, I'm the neighbor, I want to get this field. How do you know it's your half? Maybe your half is the other half. Or we say that, no, you have 50% of 100%, which means that every single centimeter of that land, half of it belongs to me. So then naturally, I am a part owner of this particular land, so I am a bar mitzvah. But then we continue. Rashi says that this Gemara has nothing to do with the previous Gemara because of the way the wording of this Gemara. Others disagree. But it's like this. You want to sell the field. No neighbors there. Nothing to do with neighbors. You have you have a neighbor that's local, and then you have a neighbor that's far away in the field. And you have to sell, you want to sell the field. Does any of them have rights first? The locals always have first rights. The locals have first rights. You have a neighbor, but then you have another person who's not your neighbor, but he's a Talmid Chacham. Who should get first? Talmid Chacham Kaidem. Talmid Chacham comes first. And Rashi says clearly we're not talking about a bar mitzvah literally, because a bar mitzvah should a Talmid Chacham doesn't have to be a mensch, because remember it's on the buyer that we say that he has to allow the neighbor to buy. So when we say shachar, we don't mean literally next on the doorstep. I mean in the area. And the Talmid Chacham is not from the area. A Talmid Chacham comes first because you have to give the recheres to Talmid Chacham. Kara the Talmid Chacham, you have a relative. You have two options: to sell to your relative and sell to Talmid Chacham. Talmud Chacham kaidem. Talmud Chacham comes first. Iboiluhu. Ask a question. Shachen v'karev mai. You have a neighbor, but you have a relative. Okay, we said a Talmud Chacham comes first. But what about we have no? We don't mean to get a bar metzia. We know a shachen in the neighborhood and a relative. Who comes first? Toshma, come in here. This is hard to hear, but this is what it says. Toshma, come in here. There's a pasuk where the pasuk says, Toiv shachen karev. Shlomo says that it's better for you, a neighbor that's your friend, that close to you, me'ach rochik, than a family member who's far away. So therefore, you have to engender that relationship. You have to nurture it all the time. So therefore, you should give it to your neighbor rather than to your relative. Rather than your relative. Taisus, however, doesn't like this. Taisus, the whole Gemara talking about Bava Metzia. Why all of a sudden are we talking about two strangers and the question is who gets priority? It doesn't belong here at all. In Gemara Shavuos, we talk about the laws of Talmud Chacham, how you can treat Talmud Chacham, and we had about businesses. Why suddenly here? So Taisus, we are talking about Bava Metzia. You have two Bava Metzias, but this is what it means when it says Shcheni Asada. The guy, you have a field out near the end of the city. The guy, what do you call it? The shachan in his backyard has a little bit of a field, and that is your neighbor on one side. So the guy lives in the city, and the back of his house is already outside of the city, and it's contiguous to a field. Then you have another guy who's on the other side of the field, so it's far away from the city. So then we say that who's considered a bar metzia, the one who lives in the city. But it doesn't explain why that should be so then. Then the Gemara continues. Again, remember, we're never supposed to disadvantage the vendor. So the Gemara continues. What happens in the following case? How do you do the Tav? How do you do the You have two
Remotel.
Yeah.
It's not obviously talking about a case where you live in the city and your field is out in the country. Who's the bar metzia then? Obviously, the neighboring field, I presume, is your neighbor, or is it your neighbor in the city?
We're talking about the way Tosfos learns is that you have neighbors on both sides. One side, the person who's a neighbor lives in the city. The back of his house is his field, which is contiguous to yours. Then the other neighbor has a field on the other side of the field, so it's remote, it's far away. So now you have to choose who's the bar metzia, the one who lives in the city, and it's the back of his house that borders onto your field.
No, I get that, and I understand that that's a situation. In a separate case where you've got your field out in the country where you don't live, but you live in the city, right, and you've got a neighbor in the city who wants to buy your field.
No, it's only contiguous to the field. Because the logic is that it's a lot cheaper for you. We'll see in 1 minute. It's a lot cheaper for you to have two fields contiguous to each other. You can have one person working both fields at the same time. Okay, what happens if one person is prepared to pay Zuzitavi, money that's acceptable everywhere? Bahani Zuzikuli, another one will give you money, it's not acceptable everywhere, but it's more valuable. So which one, and they're both your neighbors, which one should you give it to? Lesbe Mishun Dinamasa, you can choose whichever one you prefer. Remember, it cannot be to your disadvantage. If you plan to travel or whatever it is, and you need the money that is acceptable everywhere, that's your choice. If you're not planning to travel and you want better money that has more value, then that's your choice. Hani Tzaidi Bahani Shadi. You have two people who came to you again. One person gave you the money. Remember, again, according to Rashi, there's nothing to do with bar metzias, neighbors, and according to Tosfos, it's all to do with neighbors. Hani Tzaidi Bahani Shadi. One person gave you money in a bundle, and one person gave you money that's loose. And again, lesba mishud din bar metzia. There's no law of bar metzia here as well. Why? Because one person sent the money in a bundle, obviously wants to make sure it's safe. But the vendor says, I'm scared to open the bundle because maybe the moment I open the bundle, you're going to accuse me maybe and say, oh, you said there's $150. There was actually 160. I don't want any kindness to me, recrimination. This guy came loose. Obviously, he trusts me. I'll take that money. Again, it's up to the vendor to take whatever is more advantageous to this person. Okay. And then the Gemara continues. Omar, he said, Ezel, I will go. The Atrich, I will bother. The neighbor says, oh, you want to sell? I'm going to go home and I'm going to try to, gather the money together. You don't wait for him. Omar, he said, Ezel, if he says, I'll go home and get the money from my safe. Chazin, then it depends. If the person, who's well-to-do, Then the Ozil Maisazudi, and he wants to go get money at the But wait, because we trust him that he has the money at home and he's going to get it. But if he's a person that's not financially well off, he says, I'll get the money from the house, you don't have to wait. Because on the other hand, you might lose this other buyer. Lay natrina lay. You don't have to wait. But from this Gemara, the Rishonim say, therefore we argue the Rambam. You see, such a short window. We say that if only the money is already in the house, and only if we think that the person is confident the money, he has it, and you can bring it straight away. So Bava Metzia is not an open-ended thing. Is when as soon as it happens, you have a short window to be able to say, I want it. And some Rishonim, the Mordechai and others say that if the neighbor had no idea, because sometimes you do everything very quiet. Suddenly you found out your next door neighbor's house was sold. You didn't even know it was on the market. If the neighbor had no idea till 3-4 months later that it was on the market and it was sold, then as soon as he finds out, he still has the right. He didn't forego his rights. He has the right to go ahead to the buyer and say, hey, you had no right to buy it, and I will pay for it. Okay, then Gemara continues. What about Ara Dechad Bote Dechad? One person owns the land, and another person, you gave him like a 99-year lease. The other person owns the house that's on the land, but he has no rights to the land itself. Is More Adam Akev Amore Bote. The owner of the land can stop the owner of the house from selling it to somebody else. But More Bote, the owner of the house, cannot stop the person who owns the land. He has no rights in the land. He's not even a neighbor to the land because he has no rights whatsoever. He cannot prevent him from selling it wherever he wants. Same thing, Ara Dechad, V'dikla Dechad. If the land belongs to one person and the palm trees belong to another person. Again, I gave you use of the land to plant palm trees for a period of time. He's married out of, so we have no rights to the land itself. So married out of the owner of the land can prevent the owner of the palm trees, to sell to other people. You can say I have first right. But more deeply, the owner of the palm trees, cannot stop. Now, traces. I will come back to traces. Very important traces there. Again, one person wants the land to build houses on it, and the other person wants to buy the land as a farm to sell. Yishuv Adif, a house is better. The lesbam is, even though the neighbor is the one who wants to use it as a field to grow wheat, let's say, and somebody else will come in and build a residential houses there. The person who wants to build residential is more important. Yishuv. Some of the Rishonim have gives a Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, which we had before. That'll be only limited to Yisrael. Here, just saying Yishuv, something permanent. As a result, because of something permanent, some Rishonim paskin, in fact, Shalach as well. If somebody was going to plant trees are more permanent than houses. In those days, houses, how long did they last? So a tree is more permanent than houses. If one guy wants to buy the property for trees and the other one for a house, the trees take precedence. So today probably will be different because our houses can last for a very long time. It can very well outlast trees as well. Now, Taisus comes along. Rabbeinu Tam has an unbelievable shitta. Rabbeinu Tam says that this entire Gemara, actually, before we get to Rabbeinu Tam, let's go to the bottom of the page. The Gemara continues. Afsik Mishunisa. What happens if between this field and the next field there's, let's say, some kind of a rocks, boulders that separate the two fields? So you cannot, even if you wanted to connect the two fields, let's say plantings, you can never, there'll always remain two fields remain apart. Or you have a bunch of palm trees growing there, they're all very closely compacted. Then, Hazina we see. If you can even have one furrow, you can have one row of whatever it is of a crop growing from one field into the next, you can straddle both fields. There's a Bava Metzia. Although the law, if not, there's no Bava Metzia here. Here, the Gemara gives away the reason for Bava Metzia. The reason is because it becomes one field, makes it so much easier to plant, so much easier to sow, so much easier to plow, and so much cheaper. That's the reason why. So comes along Rabbeinu Tam. His shitta is, Rabbeinu Tam says, that there's no Bava Metzia when it comes to houses. If you want to sell a house, there's no such thing that the neighbor can say, oh, I wanted to buy the house because I want my children to live there, or I want to extend my house. There's no Bava Metzia. Only when it comes to a field, as the Gemara says here, because you build one field, you can make the fields into one because you can have a telem echa going across. But not when it comes to houses. And as it is, Rabbeinu Tam says, houses usually have fences in between them, so they never become one. They always do. And if you want to buy the other house and as an investment property, so you want to push somebody out because you decided that you want to rent it out to somebody else, why is that? This guy needs a house. Plus, he says, when it comes to a field, buy another field somewhere else. Why have to buy here if you're not a neighbor? When it comes to house, there aren't that many houses available that suit your particular situation, and therefore there's no Bava Metzia by house. So interesting what the Rosh says here. The Rosh says that in halacha we don't agree at all with Rabbeinu Tam because other Rishonim say the fences have doors. You can open up the doors so they could become like one property, and but he concludes and he says, "Aval haminig is not like Rabbeinu Tam." Sorry, the Rosh says that he agrees with Rabbeinu Tam, but the minig is not like him. Other Rishonim totally agree with Rabbeinu Tam, and they say that we should have the laws of Bava Metzia when it comes to houses just as well. Okay, so then let's finish the Gemara here. Hani dala b'nei matzrani. What happens if we have 4 neighbors around the field? Who gets priority? If one guy jumps in ahead and buys it, it's a good buy. He purchases it, it's his. Whoever comes first. But the kulu also if all 4 neighbors come together in unison and they say we want to buy, you divide it like diagonals. Look at the picture here on the bottom of the Gemara. You see here, you have 2 diagonals. Each one gets an equal section. So the Shulchan Aruch goes to town. What happens if we have 2 people on one side and 1 person on each other side? You have 5 neighbors. You have 2 on one side. I say the right side. You have 2 neighbors, and then you have 1 on each other side. What do you do? And the Shulchan Aruch concludes that you still only get that quarter of a portion, and then you divide that quarter. You dissect it between these 2, bisect between these 2 people as well, and then so on and so forth. Anyway, that completes the sugya of Bar Metzia. This is it. Have a Shavuot Tov, a good
What happened
boss.
to the shul seats?
Oh, so the shul seats, I didn't have a chance to go through it properly, but the shul seats, basically, it is a question of Bar Metzia here. On the other hand, a family says we like to stick together as a family, and there's a pagam in the mishpach. If we don't stick together, people say, why is this person not here? Maybe he's not really part of the family. There's a mums or something. So there's other variables that come in, whether there's Bava Metzia. According to Rabbeinu Tam, definitely there's no Bava Metzia. There's no Bava Metzia when it comes to the house and the else, only when it comes to fields. But according to the Shulchan Aruch, there is Bava Metzia, and you have to work out, but there's so many different pratim that you have to work it out. But you could find it all in Siman Kufayin Hay, towards I can't remember which sif it is, but towards the second, I don't know, maybe Lama Daled Lama Hay, around there. Talks about shul seats, Ramah, not the Bes Yosef, the Ramah. Okay, have a good one, everybody. Shavuot Tov.
Thank you.
Shavuot
Shavuot Tov. Thank you.
See you.